Alright, hi everyone, it's me, Mrs. Egger. Currently my web camera does not work on this school laptop, so I'm trying to get that fixed. In the meantime, I'm just going to talk over PowerPoints. Anyway, it's a better way to get you guys information. So we're starting fourth quarter, and we're going to continue this search for meaning unit. And honestly, this is my favorite unit to teach. Like, we build up to it, and I always look forward to it. So I'm a little bit disappointed that it's this unit of everything that kind of gets disrupted by this outbreak. But we got this, right? So if you remember where we left off, you were in the middle of reading The Stranger. It was almost due at the time that school got canceled. And in class, we were reading Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. We had taken a small pause to do our Hamlet presentations. So I want you to check out, if you haven't already, check out the PDF of the play. The link is in the Google Hyperdoc that I posted for this week's lesson. Block 7, we left off on the bottom of page 16 of the PDF, and block 8, it was toward the top of page 24, if you want to start where we left off. I would also encourage you, there's a live recording that I have linked in that Google Doc. I would encourage you to just watch the live recording. It's the same text word for word, and plays are meant to be seen and heard. And so I think watching the play will help you understand it better. So make sure you've watched or read the play before you move on. We're going to be doing some work with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and then we're going to tie it into The Stranger. So it's very helpful, obviously, to have read the play or seen the play. So once you have viewed the play, you can check out the notes that I posted on this week's lesson. There's some quotes pulled out. There's some things I want you to think about. And then there's 2 questions I want you to answer. You can answer them separately or you can combine them and then share that preferably in a Google Doc with me. If you share it as a Google Doc, I can easily just write comments and you get those comments in a synchronous manner. If you are unable to use Google Documents, you can share with me either an email attachment or a PDF, however you're able to. But again, I prefer Google Docs in this type of situation. And then there is a final question, and I do want you to post it on Vision in the forums. And so this will be public. People will be able to read it. I encourage you to respond to each other's posts. It's kind of connecting your personal views with the play Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. There's not a right or wrong answer, but you do have to justify what your thoughts are. So this unit, along with everything that's been happening in the world, there's a vocabulary word that you might not know, apropos. It's an adjective. It means just really appropriate to a specific situation. And so this unit is apropos. It's very appropriate to what's going on now. In Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, toward the very beginning, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern try to remember, like, what's the first thing you remember? What's the first thing you remember today? They're having trouble. They're in this coin toss game that they can't really remember ever starting or ever having a coin toss game that acted this way before, landing heads instead of tails. And they realize that they've had a rude awakening. Gil says, "Do you remember the first thing that happened today?" Ross says, "I woke up, I suppose." "Oh, I've got it now. That man, a foreigner, he woke us up." Gil says, "A messenger." And Ross says, "That's right. Pale sky before dawn. A man standing on his saddle to bang on the shutters shouts, 'What's the row about? Clear off.' But then he called our names. You remember that. This man woke us up." So Rosencrantz and Guildenstern had just been going about their lives. They can't remember much of what happened before they were awoken, but now they realize they're awoken, and they're not super happy about it. Something's different about their lives. They're trying to remember at this point. It triggers an identity crisis when the king and the queen mess up their names. They can't remember, like, am I Ross? Am I Gil? Are you Ross? Are you Gil? They don't remember why they're there. They don't understand what their purpose is. And so basically, this awakening sets off kind of an existential crisis for them. What's appropriate to our situation is on March 12th, for me it was at 5 a.m. I'm not sure what time you guys got the call. My cell phone rang and it was still dark. I thought it must be a family member having some kind of emergency. Like, who else would call at that time? And it was a phone call, a messenger, Wade Byard. And in some ways, I feel like that phone call was similar to what Ross and Guil must have experienced. So they were summoned by this messenger. Back in those days, if you were summoned by a king, a messenger of the king, you really didn't have much choice. I mean, you could say no and then kind of live in hiding for the rest of your life. but basically you kind of have to do what they say. And so they found themselves in this situation where they're not really sure what's going on, and they feel like they have no control over things. And I feel like in some ways we are in a similar situation, aren't we? We were told, you know what, school's canceled. I forget how many days they initially canceled school, and then the governor canceled school for many more days than that. We kind of have been thrust into this new reality, this new normal. So in a similar way, hopefully we're not all thrown into an existential crisis, but in a similar way we are kind of being forced to question what truly matters and where do we get meaning. So it's a very appropriate topic, I think, for what's currently happening. So in our search for meaning unit, the reason that I start with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, and prefer, obviously in normal years, to read it in class so that we can discuss all these things, is because it really forces us to think about what a traditional story is. So in traditional literature, in most of the works that you've probably read, even works for fun or works for classes, you probably notice patterns. Anyone who studied the monomyth or the hero's journey, the works of Joseph Campbell, probably can recognize these patterns in most things that you've read. Like there's a rising action, the character has to leave home, either literally or metaphorically, they experience something new, they're pushed beyond their comfort zones, they have to make friends, gain allies, fight enemies, find the Holy Grail or whatever it is they're seeking, and then they come back, they're master of two worlds, they've learned everything, we all feel better for it. This is the type of traditional story that, for example, Their Eyes Were Watching God would fit. If you remember, Janie, physically and metaphorically, she had to leave home, she had something that she was seeking, but she got sidetracked, she thought that her grandmother's advice maybe would work, so she got married twice to people she really didn't love, and in the end she finds tea cake, she found the holy grail of what she was looking for, and even though their love was short-lived, she, has grown for it, and she is alone at the end of her life, but she's only 40, so she still has all these memories that she can live with, and she's happy and everything's great. That's a traditional story. We've come to expect that. Even stories that don't end happily, they end in a very satisfying way because they fill a pattern that we're used to. So, in a lot of ways as readers, we're trained to expect certain things when we read. When we first started reading Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, it's very difficult to figure out what we're even reading or what we're looking for. We don't have a main conflict. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are not strong characters. They don't have strong desires. If you were in my creative writing class and you created characters like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, I might tell you something like, I mean, they're kind of interesting characters, but nothing's really happening. No one's really going to want to read this. So why did Tom Stoppard write Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead? So he was trying to get us to think about what makes a traditional story, or what patterns we're used to, and he's trying to get us to question those things. So for example, at the end of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, Gil is getting very annoyed at the player, and he's upset for a number of different reasons. But he pushes a knife, what he thinks is a real dagger, into the player in an attempt to kill him. The player knows that it's a stage knife, and he acts this very convincing death. And everyone's impressed. Ros and Guil think that he's been killed, and then the player jumps up, and it was just fake. And the player says to Ros and Guil, you see, it is the kind they do believe in. It's what's expected. And earlier in the play, and even in that same scene, Guildenstern is trying to argue that death isn't what we expect it to be. When we watch movies and read books, death is meaningful, it's dramatic, people want to see it, but in reality it's not what we want. And earlier in the play, the player even talking about that very strange time that they had an execution, they got permission for the execution to happen live on stage, and it wasn't convincing because the person who was slated to be executed kept crying, they were out of character, the audience hated it, they were throwing things, it just was not convincing. So the point being made is that we're not prepared to expect things that happen in reality. They don't make as much sense as things that happen in literature and in stories. At the end, Ros and Guil, they push this definition of death. It's just not. It's just not reappearing. It's not this dramatic thing. It doesn't make literary sense. And that's really not comforting. When you read a story and someone just dies and there's no meaning to it, it's not satisfying. You feel kind of unsettled, right? At the end of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, before the Hamlet people come in and explain that the execution was carried out, the very last part, Gil says, well, we'll know better next time. Now you see me, now you. And then he just disappears. Not very satisfying. So what does he mean by next time? Are they coming back? Are they dead for real? Have they escaped? We don't even know. It's not a satisfying ending. It's supposed to make us unsettled. So connecting this to the stranger, any character is going to have some kind of epiphany in a regular traditional text. Like Janie in Their Eyes Were Watching God. Her epiphany is that she has always hated her grandmother. She thought she loved her grandmother, but she realizes that her grandmother has actually hurt her. Janie spent 20 years of her life miserable because she was with someone that was basically her grandmother's, Prince Charming, but terrible to Janie. The chaplain in prison, when Marceau is stuck there, he says literally every criminal that has ever sat where you're sitting has felt remorse. They've had some kind of epiphany. They stare at the wall, they find patterns in the bricks or the stones, and they have some kind of understanding. They either find religious faith or they find some kind of meaning. They understand why things are the way they are. And it's so disturbing because Marceau doesn't have a traditional epiphany. Someone, I think it was Ava, mentioned in the forum posts 2 weeks ago that she kept waiting for Marceau to have some kind of epiphany, like how many things do you need to happen until you realize what is important in life? But he never has that. In fact, his epiphany, and my camera is not working right now, so you can't see that I'm putting epiphany in air quotes right now, but his epiphany is just him doubling down on what he already thought he knew, which is that life has no meaning. And he basically says, I was right the whole time. I thought life had no meaning. I thought it didn't matter what happened, and you know what, I'm right. And that epiphany is very disturbing to the chaplain and to everyone who was involved in the trial. And in fact, it seems like a reason for the jury to adamantly sentence him to execution. There's this person who's basically contradicting what humans have been trained to accept, that there are these patterns, there's meaning, we need to find meaning in life. And if someone is basically saying that that's not true, that's kind of a danger to everyone's thinking. And so they feel better about themselves if they can kind of push that person away. And so they're in some ways relieved that he's set to be executed because they do not, that's frightening thinking, right? And so Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, in similar ways, diverges from the expected patterns, right? We expect in a normal piece of literature, a character will have an epiphany, will learn something, even if it's a bittersweet ending, something bad happens, there's some sense of satisfaction that someone has learned something that we can step away stronger and wiser. In Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, that's not really the case. And so Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead definitely diverges from these expected patterns. And so we'll be looking at why Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead does diverge from those patterns and what we're to take away from those. So I got my camera fixed between yesterday and today when I started recording again. So now you guys can see me. Hi. So continuing on, we have in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, this is really the focus of the assignment. So we have the three main groups, and this is what I'm asking you to answer 2 questions about. And then there's a forum post on Vision. I'd like you to answer the question of which of the 3 groups you basically relate to. Who do you think you are and why? So the 3 groups in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are the court of Hamlet, the players, and then Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. So the court of Hamlet, this is the regular Shakespeare characters. So Hamlet, Ophelia, the king, the queen, Polonius, those are the main ones that show up. And in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, they show up only in passing, so you really don't get that much of them. They follow the original Shakespearean lines and nothing else. There's no behind the scenes. Whereas Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, Ros and Guil, we hear things that they never said in the play. This is Stoppard imagining what they would say. All the court of Hamlet, they follow the lines word for word. They are sought after by Ros and Guil. They seem to have the right answers. The king implies that he's going to pay Rosencrantz and Guildenstern if they do a good job. The king's remembrance is often discuss. They're trying to decide, Ross and Gill are trying to decide how much they're going to be paid if they do a good job. Basically, this means that the king is the boss. He's the guy with the answers or the authority. At one point in the play, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern say, all right, everyone stay off stage. And then everyone comes on. Or they say, next, and then the next person comes on. So Ross and Gill are basically just waiting for other people to show up so that they can do their jobs. Essentially, Ross and Gill, their identities don't really mean that much without the Hamlet court. So the question is, what would an existentialist say about this authority? So Ross and Gill, they're only doing things because they know the king or the queen or someone else wants them to. So an existentialist, remember, would say there is no one, there's no any source that has the answers. You individually are the only person that can come up with the answers. So an existentialist would worry that Ross and Gill are basically putting too much trust in the king, the queen, Polonius, etc. And I want you to think about how it ends for everyone, basically, but especially for Ross and Gill. They put all their faith in the king and queen, but what happens to them? The players are the next group. So we did encounter the players a little bit more in class before we got closed out of school. So the players, they follow the basic roles in Hamlet, but we see behind the scenes dialogue the same way we do for Ros and Guil. So this is things that might have happened outside of Shakespeare's original text. So they are still ousted from their former place of glory. If you remember from Hamlet, the players were these very traditional, talented groups of actors, and they would go around and act in classical plays, but Shakespeare implied the public was basically too ignorant and too low class, basically, to enjoy that, and so the new fad was plays would be performed by these young groups of children, and the implication was there was no talent, it was just a fad, kind of like that show, Toddlers and Tiaras, and so these really talented people are now displaced and they're traveling around doing whatever they can do to make ends meet. And if you remember from what we read in class, some of the stuff that they imply that they do or offer to do, it's meant to be funny. It's adding humor to the play, of course. But there's a seriousness behind that. It's that they've been displaced. Their livelihood depends on the reactions of others. And when others are not reacting in a favorable way, they have no success. Players also note things like we're always on. The main player, kind of the spokesperson for everyone else, he says, I'm always on. At one point, they're going to perform a section of a play, and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are waiting for them to step off. And the player says, I can't come on. I'm always on. I'm always ready. The player is always ready to change roles at any moment. And I want you to think about this in real life. Are there people like the player in real life? Do some people have roles and they go from one role to the next to the next? It seems like the player is able to do that. He says he's been here before. He knows what to expect. He knows which way the wind is blowing. I also want you to consider what happens to the players as opposed to the fate of the others. We know what happens to the Hamlet cast, right? There's a big pile of bodies at the end of Act 5. We know what happens to Ros and Guil, but the players, they just keep going. There's a joke. It's kind of, you expect a punchline at the end of the play. What happens to a player when he gets old? Or an actor when he gets old? And the punchline is, well, nothing, he keeps acting. Something that I've been thinking about with this whole school closure is roles and changing roles. Back in the times before, I feel like I would get up in the morning, I would be in mom mode. I would get my kids ready, dressed, breakfast, out the door, drop them off at preschool, and then I would get to school. And I would no longer be in mom mode, I'd be in teacher mode. And so I'd teach and I'd focus on that, and then I would leave my classroom. I would take off the teacher hat, put on the mom hat, pick up my kids from preschool, go home, and I would have these very clearly defined roles. And like the players, I felt like I kind of knew what to expect and when. Now that everything's closed and my kids are here 24/7, as with obviously all parents, but I'm also teaching, I'm having to cook and clean, I have to entertain my kids, I have to try to make sure they're doing some kind of preschool learning curriculum so they learn their alphabet and colors and things like that. Everything's kind of mushed together, and so it's a lot harder to deal with. I felt like prior to this, I was more like the players. I had certain roles and I knew what to expect and when, and I did very well playing different parts at different times. There's a new learning curve now. So the last group is Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. And I want you to think about who they are. And it's kind of a question that they ask. Do they have strong identities? Do they have goals? Do they have memories? When they try to think about the last time something happened or the earliest thing they remember, they really have trouble doing that. So remember that this play is not meant to be taken literally. Earlier in this presentation, I talked about how it doesn't follow the traditional plot structure. So things are meant to be symbolic or representative and make us think. So Ros and Guil, they sometimes speak in Shakespearean dialect, but it's only when there's others, when they're in the presence of someone more important, like the king or the queen or Hamlet. When they're left alone, they feel scared and uncertain. Their dialogue is jumbled. They make mistakes with words and things like that. At one point, the king and queen mix up their names and send the two of them into an identity crisis where they have to decide, okay, am I going to respond to Ros or Guil? Just pick one. What I want you to think about is how this relates to existentialism. And especially, think about the playwright Tom Stoppard, linked to his experiences. So as a child, he had to escape literal Nazi invasion. And obviously that made him think about a lot of things. In the existentialism video that we watched, it was mentioned that primarily when these great wars were happening, World War I and World War II, it became difficult to find meaning in things, and that really helped existentialism to take off. So in this version of the Ros and Guil story, unlike in the Shakespeare version, we do get an answer to the fact that Ros and Guil knew that they were taking Hamlet to his death. They accidentally opened the letter and read it, and then they immediately just kind of decide to do nothing about it. But remember, choosing to do nothing is still a choice, right? What would you do if you had a letter that was sending someone to their execution? You now have knowledge, you are forced to make a choice. So it's kind of this existentialist dilemma. You are the one that has to make a decision. The authority, the king, is saying you're going to take Hamlet to his death. You yourself now have knowledge of that. You can't claim ignorance. So think about the existentialist idea of bad faith. It's someone who lets others make a decision for you. Ros and Guil, they immediately try to justify their decision. They talk about how, Hamlet's only a man, all men must die, etc., or someone else would have done it. They try to justify the decision to take Hamlet to his death. Think about how this would play in the playwright's mind. When he thought about Nazis, in some ways, were Nazis in a similar position. So they were given orders, just like Ros and Guil. They were told that they had to do something, and they knew that it would cause harm to someone else. But, really, you could ask, what was their choice? So if you say, no, I'm not going to follow orders, the king or Hitler or whoever would take action against you. So even though it's kind of like, well, what choice do I have? You always have a choice. Ros and Guil, they have a pretty bad choice, but they do have to make a choice. So I want you to think about Ros and Guil. What do they actually represent? If you're looking at this play from the lens of an existentialist, what do they represent? They're kind of in this dilemma. How could they act differently, or how should they have acted if they were in this situation? And is their failure to kind of take a stance and make a decision, is that kind of manifested in the fact that they don't know their names, they don't know their identity, they don't know their purpose? And then in the end, when they just kind of step away, now you see me, now you, and then they're out, is that them disappearing because they literally have no purpose? I mean, in a metaphorical way, if we don't make decisions and have a purpose, do we kind of disappear? So that's a question that the author wants us to think about. All right, so your assignment for this week, there's 2 questions. You can answer them in a Google Doc. Share with me. I'll provide feedback. The 2 questions kind of focus more on literary purpose. So look at the characters and what they might represent. Tie that into the author's purpose in writing this play. And then sort of a more fun personal prompt. Go onto Vision. There's a forum open. It's more of a personal question. Which of these 3 groups do you feel that you most relate to, and why? And I'm going to go and post my response there so that you can see it. I'll always try to be the guinea pig and post there first. Looking ahead at next steps. So because of the 2 days, Monday and Tuesday, this week of professional development, I'm going to extend out the deadline for answering these questions in the forum post till next Wednesday. So you'll have a full week. You can have the weekend to work on it. I'll respond to things as soon as I get them, but this way you don't feel rushed. And then next Monday, I'll post another assignment. So the assignment for next week is going to be a textual analysis passage. I'm going to give you a passage from The Stranger, and then one from Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, and I'll ask you to compare and contrast. We are going to soon be reading Life of Pi. I did give out books. I just had a feeling I needed to right before school got out on the 11th. So I think there were 3 books on my desk, and I cannot remember who did not get a copy. There is an online PDF that I'll share with you. I know reading in a print book is often easier, but there is an online PDF. I do think you'll enjoy Life of Pi, so keep that on your radar. If you're taking the AP exam, please make sure you're following the College Board's daily practice videos. There's no way I can make videos better than they're doing, and they have modified the test. They're creating videos just targeting the skills that you're going to be tested on for the test. It's a one question test. It's one essay. It's open source, but they do plagiarism checks and that kind of thing. Um, you should do well on it. If you signed up to take the AP exam and are having trouble deciding whether you should take it or not, please contact me, send me an email. I'll respond within 24 hours. And as always, if you're doing the AP practice and you're writing out the responses, if you want personalized feedback, share that with me. Just send me which prompt you're doing, and then I'll give you immediate feedback as soon as I can. All right, good chatting with you over the internet. I hope everyone's staying safe, and I will see you online.